Hello, my name is Chuck Wolfe. Over the years, I've worked in many different roles, including leading my own leadership consulting company since 1994. I've worked for and with some of the best companies and universities in the world, and have had the opportunity to work with government officials, military organizations, and public and private schools. I'm a leading expert and pioneer in emotional intelligence. Since 2009, I've been a volunteer hosting a radio show I created called The Emotion Roadmap: Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. I really enjoy making a difference in people's lives. The show is on award-winning community radio station WPKN in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In recent years, Simsbury Community Television has been sharing my shows on their station and on YouTube. My sincere hope is that everyone who watches regularly will learn how to use the Emotion Roadmap in their own lives by listening to people who call in to get help with challenges at work, home, and in communities. To learn more, go to www.emotionroadmap.com. If you have a comment or question, email me at cjwolfe@cjwolfe.com. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hi, this is Chuck Wolfe, and you're listening to the Emotion Roadmap: Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM listener-supported radio, also streaming on WPKN.org. Today's show is pre-recorded. It brings to you the origins of emotional intelligence with the two pioneering psychologists, Yale President Emeritus Peter Salovey, who has just recently returned to the classroom as a professor at Yale, and Jack Mayer, University of New Hampshire psychologist. The two of them were the actual pioneers who first conceived of emotional intelligence. You'll hear the origin story, which is a lot of fun to listen to. And then you'll also hear from their colleague, David Caruso. David and I had a relationship where we worked together in the past, and David was actually the person who brought me in to work with them back in the late 1990s. And you'll hear about the origins of the Emotion Roadmap and also their experience with how the Emotion Roadmap was actually helpful to them, as well as to all of you listeners and all the clients over the years that I've got a chance to work with. So listen and enjoy. Was my concept, my design, after I was asked to work with Peter and Jack by a colleague of theirs, David Caruso, is also joining us. David was actually someone who worked with Jack and Peter to develop an assessment of emotional intelligence abilities. And David and I both were subcontractors at a place called Harris McCulley, which was a very high-end outplacement firm primarily for financial services in New York City. We dealt with senior executives who were being placed in other positions, other places from the existing companies where there was a contract with Harris McCulley. And David was in charge of psychological assessments, and I had a role where I was the vice president in charge of leadership development and organization behavior. And we got to know each other there. And David asked me if I would work with David and with Peter and with Jack to help them publish an earlier version of what's now called the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, or the MESQIT. And I was very privileged to be a publisher for the first time of an emotional intelligence assessment called the Multi-Factor Emotional Intelligence Scale. And I had a really good experience working with David, where I learned a tremendous amount about this groundbreaking science of emotional intelligence. And all of you who listen to this show know that we featured the Emotion Roadmap. The name of the show is the Emotion Roadmap: Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. And it's a reflection of the model, the ability to identify, use, understand, and manage emotions. And I'm very excited to hear the pioneers who are going to be talking with us in just a moment after I give a little bit of a background on the three of them. The first one I'd like to talk about is Peter Salovey. Peter, again, is the provost at Yale University. I've got a little bit I just want to read to you kind of quickly, a couple of paragraphs about Peter. He's the Chris Ardress Professor of Psychology. He joined the Yale faculty in '86 after receiving an A.B. in psychology, an A.M. in sociology from Stanford, and a Ph.D. in psychology from Yale. He was appointed Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in 2003, and then in a year later became Dean of Yale College in 2004, and then in 2008 was made Provost. So Peter is not only an academic practitioner, but a well-recognized and respected leader at Yale. He's authored and edited 13 books translated into 11 languages and published more than 350 journal articles and essays, focused primarily on human emotion and health behavior. With John D. Mayer, and John also goes by Jack, he developed a broad framework called emotional intelligence, the theory that just as people have a wide range of intellectual abilities, they also have a wide range of measurable emotional skills that profoundly affect your thinking and action. In his research on health behavior, he investigates the effectiveness of health promotion messages in persuading people to change risky behaviors relevant to cancer and HIV/AIDS. For research, he was a recipient of a National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award, a National Cancer Institute CIS Partner in Research Award, and a Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Excellence Award. And for teaching, he has won both the William Clyde Devane Medal for Distinguished Scholarship and Teaching in Yale College and the Lex Hickson 63 Prize for Teaching Excellence in the Social Sciences. For Jack Mayer, John received his BA from the University of Michigan, his PhD in psychology at Case Western, and was a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. Mayer's interests are in personality psychology and emotional intelligence. He has served on the editorial boards of Psychological Bulletin, the Journal of Personality, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, among others. In addition to being a co-founder of Emotional Intelligence, a second area of his interest concerns a systems approach to personality psychology. His systems framework joins together a consideration of many of personality's parts, such as the self-concept, sociability, and others, along with how those parts are organized together and how they developed over the lifespan. The most recent overview of the systems framework was published in the Journal of American Psychologist. And David Caruso is a psychologist with a career in market research, marketing, and product management. He's also a researcher and test developer. With his colleagues Jack and Peter, he co-authored the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Test, the Mesquite. He's also the co-author with Peter Salovey of the book The Emotionally Intelligent Manager. And David conducts practical EI skills training sessions for managers around the world. I've also had the privilege of writing several chapters and books with David, one of which we did for the U.S. Army in Fort Leavenworth there. They use one of our books for their managerial and leadership text. And I'm very pleased to have had the chance to work with David in helping to develop the certification, the original certification program for teaching people how to use the Mesquite. So I'm thrilled that we have these people to talk to today to kind of go over a little bit of the history about how emotional intelligence got discovered. I'm very excited. I hope you are too. And I hope all those who are listening will recognize that our show is on weekly on Wednesdays from 12 noon to 1 p.m. And we talk a lot about how to help people manage their emotions and their emotional relationships with others. So let me say first, hi, Peter, and hi, Jack. I understand you're both online. And David, have you joined them yet?
Yes, we're all here. This is Peter.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having us.
I'm very excited to have you, Peter. And Jack, you're on the phone?
Yeah, I'm on. I hope I'm online too.
Yes, you are.
Hear me there?
We hear you fine.
And Chuck, this is David, and I'm here in Peter's office.
Okay, that's great. I'm thrilled to have all three of you there. And now, maybe I could start with you, Peter, just talking a little bit, and Jack chime in about how the two of you discovered this area of interest. And I know it took place, and it was sort of a journey about how you got to talking about emotional intelligence and how you ended up discovering what we now call emotional intelligence, ability-based branches. And if you could give us a little bit of history, Peter, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Chuck, be happy to. I think it came out of work that both Jack and I were doing in the 1980s concerning the relationship between moods and emotions on the one hand, and cognitive activities like attention and memory on the other. And in different ways, both Jack and I were working on this question of how are cognitive activities affected by emotion? How does the arousal of an emotion change what people pay attention to, change what they can remember? Change how they make a decision. And I think we were noticing many different phenomena in conducting those experiments. One, that people differed. For example, at the end of an experiment, where you put people in a mood and tested their memory, and then talked to them about what they thought the experiment was about. Some people were very aware. Well, it seemed like you were trying to manipulate my mood. Others had no idea what had just happened. And if you asked them, well, if you thought we were manipulating your mood, what did you think the effect was? Some of them were very insightful. Others of them weren't. And so Jack and I were sharing many of these sort of experiences with participants in our experiments. And that summer found ourselves at a conference in a beautiful beach town in North Carolina, and began to talk about, well, maybe there are a set of skills or competencies around which individuals differ that have to do with identifying your emotions, understanding them, managing them, and using them in cognitive processes. And we wrote, what came out of those conversations was a paper that we wrote together where we titled it, and we titled that paper Emotional Intelligence. And after some false starts in trying to get it published, we did publish it. And I wouldn't say that the idea caught on like wildfire. It really didn't at first. But several years later, when a more popular book by Dan Goleman came out that talked about our work on emotional intelligence and, of course, described its potential implications for education and the workplace, and tied in the very interesting neuroscience research that was happening at the same time. Suddenly, there was a lot more popular interest in the topic, and that period in the in the 90s when all that happened was a very exciting one for us. But I think we were thrilled that people found the concept compelling, that it helped organize a set of skills that hadn't been looked at in an organized way previously, or at least not often. What lay before us, of course, was, all right, if that's the case, how would you measure it, and what would it predict if you did measure it? But that all came later.
Jack, would you care to add to the story about how you and Peter first got started with this?
Well, I think Peter's description is a really great description of what happened. I can add in a little bit, maybe from one other angle. The area that we were working in was called technically cognition and affect, and it was the idea of how, as Peter described, how thoughts change in relation to emotions. And one of the aspects of that was, as Peter said, we noticed some people were very sensitive as to the relationship between their emotions and their thoughts, and others seem to have challenges in describing anything around their emotional shifts. And another line of research at the time that we were fairly cognizant of was what I'll refer to as the search for the elusive third intelligence. And in clinical psychology at the time, the most widely used scale of intelligence was the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale in its revised edition at that time. And it measured two intelligences, a verbal intelligence and perceptual organizational intelligence. And there had been a lot of speculation in the intelligence community, starting really with Wechsler's work, that there was a missing third intelligence is sort of the way it was viewed. Maybe that was a bit naive back then, but that was the general idea, that maybe in addition to verbal intelligence and this sort of perceptual or organizational or what was then called performance intelligence, that maybe there was some kind of a social intelligence as well. Well, the problem was that when people had tried to measure social intelligence, they couldn't distinguish it either from verbal or from performance intelligence. And as we developed this work and we're thinking about these people who are more aware and able to think about their emotions and recognize their emotions and so on, we thought, well, maybe social is too close to verbal because it uses a lot of language, and too close to perceptual organizational because you perceive and organize social relations and so forth. But maybe emotion is just enough different. So it is the third, that elusive third intelligence. And so that was very much on our minds, and that's where the intelligence part came in as well.
Now, in fairness, other thinkers, particularly in psychology, had insights along these lines. And perhaps the most relevant one is Howard Gardner up at Harvard, who in the 1980s really popularized the notion of multiple intelligences. I think in his first book he argued for 7 kinds of intelligences. And one of them had to do with what he called intrapersonal intelligence, which included, understanding your feelings and making judgments on the basis of them. And so this idea, we like to think that our 1990 paper brought all of this together, but I don't think we want to claim that no one was having relevant thoughts along these lines at the time. It was very much in the air.
There also seemed to be kind of a very visceral reaction to it by some psychologists who are just struggling with the idea of a third intelligence. And it seems like over time, though, you've answered some of their questions.
I think one of the big, questions in psychology was the one of measurement. If you're proposing that there is more than the traditional 2 kinds of intelligence, verbal and performance, as Jack mentioned, you better prove it. That is, show that you can measure it, show that it is distinguishable once you measure it from traditional intelligence, and then show that it matters, show that it predicts something.
I think.
Well, it turned out that challenge was a more complicated one, perhaps than anyone thought. It took many years to develop a way of measuring emotional intelligence as a set of abilities, as a set of skills, reliably, meaning that you would get the same scores if you measured a person now and a week from now and a month from now. And then you had those studies had to be done to show that if you measure their traditional intelligence, if you measure aspects of their personality, and if you measure emotional intelligence, that emotional intelligence still matters. I think we are now at a point where there's a body of research supporting all of that. But, in 1995, 1996, 1997, that didn't exist. And some were quite skeptical that it would ever be possible to generate that body of knowledge. But a lot of hard work from many different people, including yourself, Chuck, I think helped establish the concept as a valid one.
Thanks. Jack, were you going to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to agree that I think a number of us who were reading Howard Gardner at the time were very inspired by his vision of the possibility that there were other intelligences. And I think that Howard intentionally left a vacuum in his wake because he was for various reasons very skeptical about intelligence measurement as an enterprise, and so he never tried to measure his intelligences, and in fact he discouraged any attempt to do so. And so when Peter and I started talking about this and so forth, we really weren't sure, well, will we go ahead and measure it? And if so, what would happen? Would it actually exist? But there did seem to be an opportunity. And what many people may not be aware of is that Peter and I, along with an undergraduate student named Maria DiPaolo, at the same time as we wrote, at the same year as we published the article on emotional intelligence, the theoretical article, had begun to look at the possibilities for measuring emotional intelligence. And and it seems kind of silly to me in retrospect, but it was, I think, certainly the case. I don't know, Peter's recollection may be different than mine about this. But we went out and we asked people to look at pictures of faces and pictures of visual designs and pictures of and depictions of colors, and to tell us about the emotionality of those three sets of stimuli. And then we gave it, as I said, to about 100 or 200 people, and looked at the results. And we were kind of dumbfounded because it worked. It seemed as if there was this sort of general ability to recognize emotions in these pictures and colors and designs. And we talked with one another about, well, what's the best way to evaluate a correct answer, and we decided we would use some kind of a majority rules criterion. And this thing worked, and the people who were better at it scored higher on self-reports of empathy. And Peter and I think, Peter, if it's not a mistake to say this, we kind of scratched our heads after that. We went and we published it, and we said, what does that mean? It looks like this thing's really there.
Yeah. I think that early study was very encouraging that it could be measured.
Yeah, but just to clarify, our doubt was, well, can we use majority rule as a criterion for what's a right answer to an emotional problem? That is, and I think that really gave us pause for a couple of years. What is the best way to identify the correct answer, and how would you justify that?
Right, and I think we would still say that's a good way, and there are other ways as well.
Right, and fortunately for us in the field, the ways are often in agreement.
And they're often in agreement.
One of the things that I think is important to recognize is that, there's an old expression, the map isn't the territory. And so when people get evaluated on this assessment, the Mesquite today, in my experience, and I know, David, you've done a lot of this as well, that sometimes they wonder, why am I writing about colors and pictures and feelings about these things? How does that relate to anything that I do in life? And what I actually find is when I debrief the assessment and talk to the people about what are the emotional challenges they face in life, how have they dealt with emotions over the years, and in this radio show, how have people learned to deal with feelings? And as I listen and I talk with people who have taken the assessment, and I suggest to them that let's just talk about what this assessment might mean and talk about it in your real life and how it's playing out, I find 99% of the time people are saying, I can't believe that test actually reflects my abilities. And in learning about abilities, years ago I used to be a therapist, and I remember often a typical scenario would be a couple would come in and the wife would say, you know what, my husband just doesn't get how I feel. He's really not responsive to how I feel. He's not even trying. And I thought if I had given the assessment, and I want to walk through the assessment and the model in just a second, and I had found out that this husband's ability to identify emotion or sense emotion, the two major inputs for how you identify or understand what other people are feeling, were really low. And it actually was an ability deficiency in emotional intelligence that was causing him not to get his wife, and it wasn't intentional. Wouldn't that change how the wife felt about the husband? Because it wasn't that he wasn't trying, he wasn't able. Almost like you have an emotional learning disability. And so I began to realize that there's a tremendous amount of power and knowledge in your test, and I don't know that enough people recognize just how powerful it is. So I'd actually like to kind of walk through the emotion intelligence branches, if we could. Have you thought about how you wanted to do that? I know that we talked about each of you taking a shot at that.
Sure. Maybe, David does the most work of the three of us on administering the Mesquite, especially in the workplace, and more recently in school settings as well. And maybe, David, you want to walk through how you would present these four skills and the test to a...
Sure. So as Chuck, as you mentioned, it's important to describe these abilities in a way that clients understand and they resonate with and they can apply. So I think similar to what you do, we'll simply say the ability model has four components, four different abilities. We measure it in different ways. The first is your ability to accurately perceive emotions. That's what you were saying before, which is, are you reading others' emotions accurately? In terms of whether there are colors or designs or anything else, we often talk about, is this a friendly room? Is this a friendly crowd? Do you get good vibes here? Is this should I walk down this alley, or is it a safe or a dangerous environment? So we measure that in a couple of ways. We show you a picture of a face. We show you pictures of environments. We ask you basically how much emotion is present in each of those. And that relates, again, to your ability every day to readily pick up on those signals. That's the first ability. The second ability, I think, is the hardest one to both explain and for us to measure. It's the ability to use emotions to help you think. And sometimes we think, it's emotions that get in our way, and we have to get rid of them. But Peter started out with that research about how emotions can actually influence your thinking or decision-making in a positive way. So here, for instance, I sometimes ask a question of clients. Would you ask your boss for a raise if you were in a bad mood? And Chuck, you might remember that question because I think that's yours.
It might very well be, David.
So I love that. I think you came up with that, and immediately everyone's going to say, "Well, no, I'd never do that." Well, why wouldn't you? Because he's going to say no. Well, why? Because he's in a bad mood, and being in a bad mood, you're more likely to say no. So we ask a bunch of questions there about which moods or emotions help you in different kinds of problem-solving areas. And then the third ability is understand emotions, and that's what we're kind of doing now. We're using language. We're coming up with vocabulary. So here, instead of saying, how you doing, and you say, okay, and you say, how am I, and I say, fine, you might say, well, I'm fairly pleased this morning. I'm somewhat content. I might say I'm somewhat distracted or a little anxious, or I'm not just pleased nor happy, but I'm joyous for the following reasons. And then the fourth ability is managing emotions. Let's say you perceive that you are anxious. You realize that anxiety is not conducive to having a brainstorming conversation. That's the second ability. The third ability is you understand that you're anxious because you left your car in a no parking zone. You're worried about a ticket. And then manage emotions means, kind of irrelevant. I'm going to get the ticket. I'm going to get the ticket. I'm on the radio now. I need to focus on this task. Let me take a deep breath. Let me use some self-talk. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And you move on. So those are the four abilities.
So I hope that if you do get a ticket,
and that's a little bit about how we measure it.
So I hope that if you do get a ticket, that you can write it off as a business expense.
Thank you for that advice, Chuck.
Okay, so those are the four branches then, and one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand, while I want to focus on your work, the three of you, I do want to just talk a little bit about the difference between what it means to have an ability-based assessment versus a different kind of assessment, whether it's trait or personality-oriented, but there is a number of other tools out there that seemingly measure emotional intelligence. And when I'm asked about that, my comment is often that I think that there are other people doing good work and meaningful work. I don't always see them, however, as measuring intelligence. So I'm not asking you to comment on other people's work, but just to tell us a little bit about how the ability-based measure and assessment based on those four branches of identify or perceive, use, understand, and manage is different perhaps than the others.
Sure. Well, we modeled the Mesquite on a traditional IQ test, where a person taking the test would actually have to engage in tasks that in some way tap into the competencies that we're trying to assess. So as Jack described, we could show you a picture of a face and ask you what emotion, or we can show you some words describing emotions and ask you to define them. Or we can give you scenarios that involve trying to manage an emotion, cheer yourself up or calm yourself down, and ask you a set of questions about the strategies that might produce that emotional change or not, might be more or less effective. The idea is that we're trying to measure a set of abilities by actually testing those abilities in a controlled setting. Now, there are other things you can measure that are very relevant to human behavior. You can measure people's beliefs about their abilities by asking them, do you think you're the kind of person who knows how to cheer yourself up? We would call that a self-judgment test or a self-report test. You can also ask other people to report in on someone's abilities. So when you think of David, Chuck, do you think he's the kind of person who's good at understanding what other people feel or not? And the point is, it's a kind of empirical question, meaning it's open to research what the relationship is among these three different kinds of information. Your judgments about yourself, other people's judgments about you, and your actual demonstrated abilities. What's been kind of interesting in the emotional intelligence domain is while there's some overlap among these three, there's a lot of distinction among these three too. They seem to be getting at different things psychologically. So the confusion in the literature right now is the term emotional intelligence is used for all of it. But in fact, what really one should ask is, do we mean ability emotional intelligence? Do we mean self-judged emotional intelligence? Or do we mean emotional intelligence as perceived by other people in your social environment? And I think it's going to take more research to really piece out when do these overlap, why do they often not overlap very much, and which of them, how do they matter, and in what circumstances do which of these actually matter?
Jack, would you care to add anything to that?
I think asking people, you're going to hear our chimes from our bell tower. I don't know if you can hear those in the background or not. To my mind, I think the issue, I see the issue as a bit more settled, perhaps, than that. I think that there's widespread agreement that they're using a criterion of correctness as an absolute necessity for a measure of intelligence, and therefore that's the gold standard, is the posability type questions. My reading of the empirical literature right now is that self-estimated emotional intelligence is quite different, and it tends to overlap with measures of self-esteem and outgoingness and positive feelings, but not with emotional intelligence, at least as I define it, per se. So Peter and I may have a slightly different take on that, which we do. The three of us often have slightly, or sometimes somewhat substantially different viewpoints, which is what makes working together fun and interesting.
One of the things I'd like to add to the conversation is I have seen a much more interest and conversation in general around emotions and feelings, and perhaps because I'm kind of steeped in this world in the last 15 or so years, I've just noticed it more. But I was at a presentation with Harvard Business School professor Linda Hill yesterday, and I listened to her talk about her idea about leadership, which is managing yourself, managing your network, meaning your peers and your our bosses, and also managing your team. And integrated throughout that is her conversation about the emotions in play in all of those kinds of theoretical models about each piece. And then someone raised their hand and asked, well, you haven't talked at all about emotional intelligence, though. And this is a group of people devoted to talent management in organizations, very senior level HR people. And they were asking, it seems like emotional intelligence is missing. And what I think is, I've always felt is, I think the report that comes from the Mesquite is a tough report to write and to read, because it's kind of like when you have, if you had an analytic, a Wechsler report, could you make a template out of that for people? I don't think you really could. And that's the struggle here, versus a report that's more like a style analysis tool that is general enough that everybody sees something of themselves in it. And I think as people learn more about your model, because I think it's going to be the last one standing at some point around what's called emotional intelligence. And I believe that at some point people are going to get this idea that it's really integrated within everything. Every time people talk about any situation where emotions are really critical, and I find smart people often are stuck when something emotional is in play. Either it's in them or in somebody they're dealing with that's key to them. And I don't know that people really fully understand how powerful the model is that you folks discovered. That's my own feeling about it.
You know, Chuck, you made a really good point. Getting feedback on an ability, if you're one of these very smart, motivated, talented executives, is extremely difficult. And I think that's something I struggle with all the time, and I know you do as well. We've talked about how do you present these results in a way that the recipient is going to be open to hearing that, you know, you're not great at maybe reading people, or your management of emotions ability is lower than the average executive or person out there. And so what we found is a great way to do it is to explain the model, ask for some anecdotes. You know, your example before of, you know, I blew up at my team the other day. Well, it's interesting you said that, because when you took this test, remember you took it last week, one of your lowest scores was on what we call managing emotions. So I think you have to relate it to their life. And the other thing that is really helpful in giving feedback is I like to say that test results generate questions or hypotheses about a person. You know, never to point the finger at the other individual and say, well, you obviously don't manage emotions well. Instead, it's better to say, your test results suggest that you might have difficulty at times dealing with anger or sadness, or you might fly off the handle. Does that sound like you? So I agree with you 100%. This is really difficult work to do well, and it's very easy to do it poorly.
One of the things that I've tried to do at this radio show by creating this emotion roadmap and running this show is I try to tie back questions that, and we kind of discovered this together, David, and we went a little different ways, but the idea of identifying, meaning, you know, if you found yourself in an emotionally challenging situation and you can identify how you're feeling, and you also recognize and understand and identify what somebody else is feeling that's key to whatever is going on, that you are being reflective typically because it isn't going the way that you want. There's very few of us, I think, that tend to be reflective when things are working and going our way. So as soon as they realize that something is amiss and not the feelings aren't serving them in the way that they'd like to have them serve them, that's where I use this idea of using emotions a little differently than it was, I think, in the model. But my intent is to ask, what would be the ideal emotion? I was captivated when I heard all three of you talk about how this idea of matching a feeling with a task is really innovative. I think it's the most innovative piece in a way for me, because I don't think anybody, other than maybe for a wedding or a funeral, or most people aren't thinking emotionally, how do we want people to feel at certain events? And yet I think that's so powerful to simply ask the question about what would be more ideal to feel. And then if you understand emotions, the way I think about this is how emotions work. And I often point people towards your book, the one that Peter and David, the two of you wrote, The Emotionally Intelligent Manager, because I thought that's the best explanation out there about how to use all of what's in the model for the layperson, in my mind anyway. And so this idea of understanding is about how emotions work and also how you work as an individual. People that listen to my show regularly know I'm talking to people about, if you're not successful right now in a certain area of your life and you're trying to change that, can you think of any other times when you face something similar and you've been successful, to try to help them understand what might work here for them, a scenario that's going to be able to help them to both manage their own situation and whatever the situation is with somebody else that's critical to them. So that's how I've been using the process.
Yeah, Chuck, I think these are excellent tools. I think the roadmap is a great way to help people organize their thinking around emotional intelligence. And I think these essentially questions that you ask folks to ponder are nice ways to help people develop these skills. We haven't talked about it very much in the hour so far, but people. One of the reasons I think people like this concept is because they can imagine there must be ways that they can get better on this set of competencies over time. And I think you're describing the kind of interactions that help people get better, improve.
Well, I actually think that comes up in different ways for me, helping people just to think through when I get to the understand stage, what we've done there, and this is partly what I learned with you, David, working with you, was this idea that you're going to develop several scenarios, several strategies that are possibly ways that you can move from one feeling to a better feeling, a more ideal feeling. And in developing those strategies, you then, for me, the managed piece is all about what are you really willing to do and what are you able to do. And then if you're willing and able, then the chance is that you've got a strategy that has some real potential to be successful. That's the way I think about developing it. There is a question out there from one of the forums that I solicited from, which was to ask, and maybe you all have different thoughts about this. I know at different times I've referred people to Ekman's work about trying to recognize emotion more effectively in faces or in people. Are there other strategies that you've thought of or conceived of about how people might build their skill set? And is it even possible? Because I know we've had this conversation. The one time I sat on a panel with three of you, and I remember listening to you talk about, can you actually improve your emotional intelligence scores? And I think all three of you had a different answer for that at the time. I don't know if it's changed, but is there a way to become better at being more emotionally intelligent?
Well, Chuck, as you know,
one of the ways that we've
done, you and I,
one of the ways to answer this.
Sometimes we don't even bother to ask that questions or answer it. The one question is, can you get better at a test score? And who really cares? But I think the question that you're asking and that people really want to know is, can I improve my daily interactions? And you know what the answer is, and the answer, of course, is yes. So, for instance, if I'm really not very good in my underlying ability of perceiving emotions, you develop remedial or compensatory strategies. People who have really low spatial ability and they get lost all the time when they get behind the wheel and drive, their emotion roadmap should be to not increase their spatial ability, but to buy a GPS.
Right.
All right, and that's the way to do it. So if you can't perceive emotions well, rather than worry about, oh my gosh, my test score is low, can I get it increased? You ask people how they're feeling, and don't accept the okay, fine, how are you? Or you ask very, very specific questions. Is there, like a salesperson would do, is there anything preventing you from buying this car today? Well, yeah, my wife isn't here. So asking others at the end of a meeting, how do you think that went? If there's one suggestion you could make for my next presentation, what would it be? As opposed to, hey, did you like my presentation? Yeah, it was okay. So someone who perceives emotions will hear that hesitation. If you don't perceive emotions well, you're just going to hear, oh, they love my presentation. So I think it's developing remedial strategies.
It's very, very interesting, David. One of the thoughts I had as you spoke was, my show's called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. And so people might look at my show in a new way now that you've said this. I'm kind of a GPS for this stuff.
You're an emotional GPS, Chuck.
I'm trying to be.
Look at it.
Jack, I think you were going to add something to this. You want to jump in?
Thank you. I think actually, David, I'm absolutely in agreement with what David just said.
Oh, okay, that's fine. One of the other questions that came up was kind of interesting, I thought, was, and we haven't really talked about the results that we're seeing. And maybe because some of you see some of the research, I know that you're engaged in some of it in your own. And I do want to mention that, Jack, you have a website that has a lot of, for those people that really want to dive deep into this. You want to talk a little bit about your website? Maybe take a minute just to do that, because I think there's a lot of information for those of you who are intrigued by the subject and want to know more. I think Jack's website is really extremely helpful in terms of just giving you lots and lots of information about the concept and about some of the studies that have been published out there.
Well, thanks, Chuck. If people are interested, they can either Google emotional intelligence and my name, Mayer, or probably UNH also will work for the University of New Hampshire. And this is a site up at www.unh.edu /emotional_intelligence. And basically this site and some of the others that another one that David has up grew out of a lot of email questions and requests that we had received. And rather, websites are very efficient ways of disseminating information. So we put up on this website an overview of our 4-branch model, a list of our publications, some discussions. There's some archival material in there, discussions among leaders of the field from a number of years ago as to what what's the best way to conceptualize emotional intelligence. Chuck, I don't know if you've got anything. You may well have some stuff up there on the website. I should have checked before this broadcast, but it's quite possible that Chuck has some stuff up there as well, because I know whether or not he does, that he was very instrumental in starting to disseminate information about emotional intelligence, and continues to be so. So if people are interested in those sorts of conceptual academic issues, that's one place they can go. Also, there's information there on obtaining the mesquite.
Well, I know, too, that I think, Peter, in your world, some of the people that work with you have been involved with an insurance company where they measured some financial analyst work. And I know David Rossetti shared with you the results of the work in Australia. And so I've seen different people using the mesquite or even the MESA the earlier version of the test for research that is showing some real benefit. You talked about prediction, Peter. What is it your model's predicting, if you could share some of those results?
Sure. The study at the insurance company let us look at whether our measure of emotional intelligence, the mesquite, predicted performance appraisals by peers and supervisors, and then as well as actual salary increases recommended for them at the end of the year. And in fact, it did. All four dimensions were important. Probably the dimension that was most important was the managing emotion branch, which seems to be especially related to competency in the workplace and compensation reflecting higher competency in the workplace. More recently, the collaborators in my lab, especially Mark Brackett, who originally was a graduate student of Jack's at the University of New Hampshire and then came to Yale afterward and has become a research professor here. He's doing work where emotional intelligence is incorporated into a curriculum for school children of different ages. He's now developing curricular materials for children of all ages, and then looking at whether emotional intelligence in the class, emotional intelligence can be improved by the curriculum, and whether it relates to behavior in the classroom and ultimately academic performance. And in some very careful studies with very large samples of children, for example, the entire archdiocese of Brooklyn and Queens, New York, he's getting results that look quite fascinating. Emotional intelligence really matters, and it has a direct connection to academic performance, too.
That's interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask about, is actually a couple things before we run out of time, is this idea. I want to talk a little bit about the branch and of managing emotions, because I have found a fascinating distinction when people, there's two subtasks that are part of that branch. So one is this managing emotions, which seems to be about self-management, and then emotional relationships, which seems to be about managing relationships more with others. I found that when somebody is very high in managing emotions and somewhat, at least 20 points lower on emotional relationships, that they tend to be seen as someone who takes care of themselves and isn't so concerned about others. Now, I realize that this isn't measuring performance, but it so often seems to be correlated. Any thoughts about that from any of the three of you?
Yeah, Chuck, I explained it in the same way. That's how it can be seen by others, that they're good at taking care of their own needs. They give great advice to themselves, but not so to others. And it's a really interesting profile, just as much as the other, as the flip
side, right?
Which is you don't manage your own emotions well, but you're great at managing emotions with others.
When I see that high score in emotional relationships and a 20-point drop on or more on managing emotions, one of the questions I'm always asking people is, my guess is a lot of other people are probably going to see you as this emotionally intelligent, smart person,
yes,
because you're so concerned about them.
Yes.
But I'm guessing you're drowning inside.
And that's I agree with you 100%. And I'll probably say people would be really surprised to know what's going on inside your head. They probably think you have it all together. And usually at that point, the client starts laughing, which is
right.
in recognition that that's exactly what what's going on, which is they're great at helping others manage through tough situations. But like the shoemaker's children, they're going barefoot, emotionally barefoot in their own lives. And, which is why doing feedback on the Mesquite can be so enormously helpful to a client like that. It's a real gift to give to someone, to that kind of insight, to then say, you're not taking, let's say again, your emotion self-management score is lower. You're not taking care of yourself, and you're giving to others. At some point, you're going to lead to burnout. And you might value this giving of yourself to others, but in order to continue to do that job, that stellar job that you're doing, you have to think about your own needs as well. So that's sometimes a good way to get their attention around that. They may not care. They may really want to be focused on others. But to be focused on others, you need to take care of yourself to some extent.
Thanks, David. I wanted to ask just Peter and Jack this question, because one of the questions that came up in these forums where I solicited information from others, there was this question about why, if this is so powerful, aren't there college curriculums where people are being taught about emotional intelligence? And since you're both in colleges and universities, I thought I'd ask the question.
Well, in some ways there are. So Mark Brackett, who I talked about earlier, does offer a course at Yale, for example, for undergraduates on emotional intelligence and human emotion, where they deal with a lot of this material directly. And of course, they focus more on the science behind emotional intelligence than they do on self-improvement, but it is, there is a very good course on it. But I might also argue that when you take a course on, let's say, music performance or the visual arts or acting and theater, maybe what you're doing is actually taking a course that helps to enhance your emotional intelligence. I think even reading great literature. Yale has a wonderful course on the novels of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and I always think that, if you're reading novels of that kind, what are you reading about? You're reading about the motives of people. You're reading about trying to understand their emotions, reading about the connection between their emotions and their thinking. So, I would say in a more implicit way, there is a lot that can help us develop emotional intelligence that is taught, for example, in college.
One of the things that I'm hoping happens over time, I'm hoping that I get a chance to work with this professor at Harvard, Linda Hill, on managing your network, because it's a piece that they really don't know much about how to make it work, this idea of working with peers and bosses in terms of like something really concrete. And what I'd like to see in terms of integration is this idea of each of those pieces of identify, use, understand, and manage, debriefing those novels, Peter, that people begin to make not emotion intelligence as a separate course, but as an integrated way of thinking about the how all of this plays out, about how emotion plays, whether if you're teaching a course on change management in a business school setting, you're talking about if you introduce a large scale change, of course there's going to be organizational resistance. A lot of it's emotional. How do you defuse those emotional landmines? How do you work around them? How do you compensate for what you know is going to be explosive? So I think at least the way I think about this question is more about how do we make emotional intelligence in the model you've created? Because I really, I'm obviously fascinated by the model and highly respectful of it. How do we make it more a part of everything that's taught, where emotions are in play and present and powerful? So anyway, I'm running out of the hour here, everybody. And anything last comments from any of the three of you folks?
Well, Chuck, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about emotional intelligence with you today, and I do recommend Jack's website for listeners who want to follow up. There's a lot of resources there. Again, it's www.unh.edu/emotional_intelligence. And there's a lot there, and we welcome people actually reading, especially some of the original papers in this area, to get a better sense of what the research basis is for this idea. We appreciate the chance to talk about it today with you.
Thanks so much for being on the air, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you for having us. I want to express my thanks as well and say, the kind of applied conversations that you have with people are very informative to us as we design and think about new tests in the area. For example, the split that you described between high managers or high self-managers and low other managers, and vice versa, are splits that we don't necessarily think about when we're writing that test. And it's very, very interesting to me to hear the kinds of real-life conversations that you're having with people on the front lines of thinking about their feelings and how those feelings can assist them in their lives going forward. So
and Chuck, was great to talk to you again. Thank you for helping me, sending me down the road with the roadmap and helping to apply the scientific model in a workable, understandable language for clients out there. So I appreciate that collaboration, and I'll look to it in the future as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you all for listening to our show today. You've been listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut, listener-supported radio. That was the conversation that I had a number of years ago with Peter, Jack, and David. And very recently, just this past January, a brand new version of the Emotional Intelligence Ability Test called the Mayor Salovey Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, or the Mesquite 2.0, has just been released. And it is terrific. And I'll be saying more about that in the days to come. So thank you again for listening. I look forward to being back with you on the first and second Wednesdays of each month. Bye-bye now.
For over 40 years, SCM has been the voice of our town,
bringing us together through local programming,
education, and live broadcasts.
SCM isn't just about television.
It's about empowering our community,
ensuring our voices are heard during government meetings,
and celebrating milestones
like our high school graduations.
But today, SCM faces a challenge.
Our funding structure is based on television subscriptions.
And it's no secret, people have been cutting the cord.
With a shift to internet-only subscriptions,
SCM receives less revenue,
even though all our programming is freely available online.
We need your support.
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 Your donation can make a difference.
It will ensure that SCM remains open,
continues to educate our youth,
and keeps our community informed.
Thanks to SCM, I've been honing my creative skills, helping me work towards my college degree.
SCM is crucial for keeping our community connected.
SCM isn't just here to broadcast local events. They're actually preserving Simsbury's history.
Join us.
Join us in preserving Simsbury's voice.
Simsbury's voice.
Together we can ensure that SCM continues to thrive
for generations to come.
Visit our website
or scan the QR code on your screen to make your donation.
Every contribution
counts.
Thank you for supporting Simsbury Community Media,
where your town,
your schools,
and your government come together.